We are going to take a look at a practical example of using the React Context API to be able to manage the state between two different pages within a Next.js application. Hello world, my name is Igor and welcome to my channel. If you enjoy coding challenges and tutorials just like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel down below. Code that you're about to see is part of a challenge that it's ongoing on Twitch that I'm live streaming every week. This project is an Among Us clone that by the end we should be able to play together with each other. If you want to know more, you can check the playlist in the card right up here to know everything that we made from the start. So now regarding this part. Okay, so currently we have an index page and a button to take us to the next page. However, our idea is to carry information from this page to the other where the game is actually happening. To do that, we're going to be using the React Context API that enables us to do just that. So the first step is to go up to the React documentation on context. And there we can see a lot of information on how to use the React Context API, when to use it, and some examples of how you can implement it. So to keep everything organized, we created a new folder called context where we created a file responsible for managing the game context. We followed the template on the documentation and created a file that has a game context with equals the react.createContext function, and then a game provider that's going to be the one that's going to be wrapping our components. This provider is going to have at first just this state, which is going to be a player, and the setPlayer function to manage its state. It then exports a game context.provider with a prop value that's going to expose both the player and the function to change the player. And then we're going to use a helper function that I like to use. It's going to serve like a hook. So when you want to use the state, you import this function into your file, and if everything's okay, you can use that state, no problem. But if you're not inside a game provider, you cannot use the state because it's not going to work, so it throws an error instead. Okay, so lastly, we just put inside of our game provider the children for it to render all of its children that's being passed in the props. We now went to the component that's responsible for rendering the entire app, and we wrapped it with the new game provider that we just created. So now every component that's inside both of these tags can use the game state providers. Now currently on our index page we have a button that's a Next.js link, so when you click it you change page, but we don't want to do that anymore. Before we change pages we want to do some action, so for that we need to ditch the next link component that we had before and we transformed it into a button that's going to have an onClick function to perform some action before changing pages. So the easiest way to test this context API, it's going to be to just pass from one page to another a string that's going to be our player name, and we're going to prompt the player name just as we click on the button and show a modal with the input for the player to insert its name. So we're going to create a modal from the ground up. So to create our modal, we're going to use a state within our index page. It's going to be just a boolean of the modal open, so when that is true, the modal is going to show. Then on our new button that we created, we're going to say that on click, we want to set the modal to open, so it's going to show us a new component. For now, we're just testing with a new div saying modal in front. When I click on game on, the state is updated and the modal shows up. So now we're going to create a real modal component to be globally used whenever we want. For that, and to keep everything organized, we're going to create a new definitions file, modal.d.ts, to be used as the modal props, so we know what we can pass to it and how we can use them within a component. So now just say that props is of that interface type. And our props have a title, children, and opened to know whether the modal is open or not. And then we can change our index component that we created to be this new component that we just did. Opened is going to be controlled by the state of the index page itself. So now on our modal component, we changed it to the following. We only render anything if our opened prop is true. Otherwise, we show nothing. We now check if everything's working by clicking on a button. And then we have a new content that shows up. So our component is working. Now we want this component to actually look like a modal. So we're then going to style our outer div of the modal to fill the entire screen. So it's going to be the height of the viewport and the width of the viewport, and it's going to have a fixed position to be above everything else. Then we need a new inner div to be holding the content. So we have an outer that's going to fill the entire screen, and then the inner content is just going to fill a part of the screen. We then added a color to the outer div, but we noticed that this is going to hide everything that's behind it because it has full opacity. So everything behind it is not visible. So we're going to create a new CSS file for the modal specifically so that we can manipulate the colors exactly to the way we want it. So inside the styles folder, we created a modal.css, and in the global CSS file that's imported for the entire app, we imported that new file. We defined a class called modal container, and the background color is going to be RGBA of black, but only with a touch of opacity so we can see the content behind it. And this is the final result. We now can see the content behind it, but it's a bit darker. So we then went back to our modal component, and we added some classes for its content to be centered on the screen. We added the flex, then justify center and item center to center it across both axes. Then on the inner content of the modal, we set a specific width so that it wouldn't fill the entire screen and that it would take the flex properties to justify itself. Just fix that class that we mistakenly put there, and then our content is exactly in the middle of the screen. We then style it a bit more to give it background color, to round the corners. And then some extra sections to separate concerns. So we're going to have a top section, it's going to have a title and a closing button. Now we're going to use flex row to have them on the same line, then with a space between and some padding as well. We then have the content container, which has also padding and then a border on top and bottom to be separated from both top and bottom containers. We then passed into our modal a new prop called onClose, so that when we click on that close button, some action is performed. So in the index page, when you click the onClose button, it's just going to set the current modal open state to false so that it doesn't show the modal. On the modal props, we need to add this new prop and say that it's a function that takes no parameters. Then when you click on the close button, we perform the action that is on our props called onClose. Then if we test that, you see that it closes the modal. The next phase consisted of actually changing the content of the modal to have that input for the player to get its name. The input is going to be of type text. And then we're going to hook onto the onChange event so that we know that when changes are happening, it's actually changing a variable that we can relate to know what the name of the player is. So every time that a key is pressed on the input, this function is going to trigger, and it's going to set our player name to the value of that input. So now we have that saved on our state of the index page. You also need to say that the value is the player name, so every time that variable changes, the input is going to change its content, and just added a placeholder to make it intuitive to what's to enter there. And now our input is working. We added a new prop that was missing, called onSubmit. Just pass the function here to log it that we know that this is working. So once we add it here, we also need to add to the props a new function submit. It takes no parameters, at least for now. Then on our modal component, there's going to be a specific section on the bottom that's only going to be visible when we have an onSubmit prop passed to our component. That's going to just be a button that's styled this way, and when it's unclicked, it's going to call the function passed in by the prop. Then when we click on it, we can see on the console that we added a console log submit, and it just logs it. So now in the index page, instead of just logging submit, we actually wanted to do something. And what we want to do is the following. We created a new function, and inside it, we can now use the game state context that we created and import from it the set player. That's the function to set the player of the context. So when we click submit, what we want to do is to set the player of the context to the player name that it was inserted into that input that we just created down there, and it's part of our index state. Next, what we want to do is import router hook from Next.js and push it to the new page that is /game. So all of this is going to happen when we click on the submit button. Now we have a problem with TypesScript on this specific case. This is because we haven't typed our context, so we can do that now. We created a new interface called iGameContext, and within its definition of the interface, for now we just have a player that's of type string for now, because it's only going to be the player name, and the set player, which is a function that sets the state of the context, that has this specific typing for the set state hooks. Now after we did all this and we save it, we can go back to the index page and the error is gone. So now everything should be working perfectly. And what we're going to do is import our useGameState function from the game context that we created, and from it export only the player from the state, and then log the result that's on the context. Then test it out by clicking on the button, filling in the player name and clicking on submit. And you'll notice that we are now on a different page. It's a /game page, and we can log the name that we passed. So now we were able to connect both pages. Okay, so this was a recap of what we were able to achieve on one of our last streams over on Twitch with this Among Us game. New videos are going to come out next week or a couple next days, because we already have more content that we can show. We have specific places on the map that we can interact with, and we have buttons that we show that the user can click. So if you want to tune in for that, you can watch us on Twitch every weekend to know what we are doing. So that is it for a quick review of how we use the React Context API in our Among Us example. And until the next time, I can only wish you happy coding.